Good day, everyone. Welcome to Metric Hub. Today, I'm going to discuss interview, which is module 7, interview, management communication and communication and for, right? So I'm going to start by defining what is an interview. What is an interview, right? An interview is defined as a pre-planned um, oral communication or oral conversation, right? So it is a pre-planned, formal, direct, indirect, oral conversation between two people, right? To exchange information about a specific matter, right? So it is a planned, meaning to say the interviewer will give the interviewee the date to come for the interview, the future date to come for interview, and it is a formal, whereby it is a formal communication, right? And also can find that it can be direct, whereby it will be face to face, or indirect through telephone, what we call a telephonic interview, right? Between two people, which are the interviewer and the interviewee. The interviewer and the interviewee, right? So they exchange information about a specific subject, depending on the type of interview that I'm going to discuss later on, right? So you need to be able to distinguish between an interviewer and an interviewee, right? An interviewer is that person who interviewed the applicant. An interviewer is the person who interviewed the applicant, right? Whereas an interviewee is the person who is being interviewed, is the person who is interviewed. It is the applicant who will be interviewed, is an applicant who will be interviewed, right? So I'm going to move on to categories of interviews. Categories of interview. There is what you call an informative interview. An informative interview, whereby it is that interview whereby it is conducted to provide, gain, and exchange information. An informative interview, from the word information, right? Information. It is done to provide and to gain and to exchange information. Examples of informative interviews include a job interview and also instruction by a manager, right? Information is provided, it is gained, and also it is exchanged during an informative interview, right? I'm going to discuss another category of interview, which is what you call persuasive interviews. Persuasive interviews, right? These are the interviews that are conducted to persuade someone to change his opinion or his behavior, right? For example, an employee who is always late at work, who always come late at work, the management might conduct what you call a disciplinary interview, right? So that they will persuade him to change his behavior, right? So another example is when the supervisor tries to persuade an employee to obey instructions, Sometimes an employee might not want to obey instructions. They can conduct what you call a persuasive interview, so that they can be able to change his opinion. They want to persuade him to change his opinion. That's what you call a persuasive interview. A persuasive interview, right? So I'm going to move on to communication barriers which influence interviews. All right. Communication barriers which influences interviews. The first barrier that I'm going to discuss is what we call semantic barrier. Semantic barrier, right? So we talked about semantic barrier. We discussed the barriers in module 2, whereby we say semantic barrier. Those are barriers that are caused by maybe jargon. It might be due to maybe slang. and accent, right? The accent, people differ in terms of the way they speak. That's what you call accent. The jargon, which is the terminology used in other professions. And then we have what we call physical barrier that might interfere with the interview. We include maybe a ringing phone. A phone is ringing. It will disturb communication, or it might be someone yelling outside. The building, right? It might also cause what? Communication barrier, which are physical, right? We also have intercultural barriers that might influence interviews, which includes stereotyping, 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 and also ethnocentric, right? Ethnocentricity, right? Stereotyping and ethnocentricity, right? Whereby when you're talking about stereotyping, it is when one believe that his culture is more superior than other culture. So, for example, a Zulu interviewee is being interviewed by a Xhosa interviewee. There might be intercultural barriers that might occur, right? We also have what we call psychological barriers that might influence interviews. For example, when you're talking about psychological barriers, we're talking about barriers that are caused by mental the mental state, right? The mental state, right? How a person is feeling, right? Right. For example, someone might be nervousness, nervousness might also interfere with what? With interviews, right? That might also cause maybe the results become what? Influenced by those physiological barriers. Anxious, someone is having anxiety, right? It might also causes communication barriers in an interview, right? So I'm going to move on to typical questions that are asked during an interview, right? There are typical questions asked during the interview, right? The first one that I'm going to discuss is what we call open-ended question. Open-ended question in that type of interview, questions whereby a person is asked to give a detailed a detailed explanation. A person will be given, is expected to give an in-depth explanation, right? That's what we call an open-ended question, right? So this question starts with what, why, and when. What, why, and when, right? For example, why did you want to work for the organization? Why did you want to work for the organization? So here, the applicant is encouraged to talk and to review his emotion. Is encouraged to talk and to review his emotions, right? Example of such questions include tell us about yourself. Tell us about yourself, right? All right, I'm going to move on to another type of question that are asked during an interview, all right, which is number two, right? Number two, which is what you call a closed-ended question. A closed-ended question, right? Which requires a yes or a no answer. Closed-ended question requires you to answer either yes or a no. Either a yes or a no. For example, do you have a diploma? Do you have a diploma? One might say yes if he has a diploma, or no if he does not have a diploma. So closed-ended questions requires an applicant to give a yes or a no answer. Yes or a no answer. That's what you call a closed-ended question. A closed-ended question, right? I'm going to move on to the third type of question, which is what you call specific question. specific questions, whereby it requires you to give a specific answer, right? The type of question whereby one has to give a specific answer. For example, how old are you? How old are you? Right? We call it a specific question because one might say 40 years, right? Which is a specific what? Answer, right? A specific question requires one to give a specific answer, to give a specific answer, right? Let's go to number 4, which is what we call a reflective question. A reflective question. This type of question is formulated by rephrasing the interviewee's previous statement. This question is formulated by rephrasing the interviewee's previous question. One might say, I am very good at social, or I'm a good, I have a social skill, right? Or maybe I'm a good social person. I socialize a lot. The company might ask you, how does your skill help? How does it benefit the organization, right? For example, one might say, I'm a hard worker. So they'll ask questions like, you said you're a hard worker. How does this benefit the organization? So the question has been formulated by rephrasing the applicant's previous question, right? We call it a reflective question. A reflective question. I'm going to move on to what we call a leading question. A leading question. So this question asked it in such a way that it gives the answer required by the interviewer. The interviewer might be looking for a specific answer, a specific answer. So you ask a question in such a way that you get that answer. So, for example, secretaries are underpaid. What do you think? What do you think? Right? That's what you call a leading question. It is asked in such a way that it gives a required answer. Right? It gives a required answer. Right? We also have what you call hypothetical question. Hypothetical question, whereby it is used. This question is used to test the applicant's intelligence, his ability to think, and the ability to solve problems. They want to see if the applicant able to think quickly. Is he able to think fast? Is he able to solve problems? What about his level of intelligence? Is he intelligent? Right? So the hypothetical question requires the hypothetical questions is asked to test the applicant's intelligence, his ability to think fast, and his ability to solve problems. Is he able to solve problems? For example, an example might include, what do you do if you won a lotto? What do you do if you won a lotto? Right? They want to test your ability to think fast, your ability to solve a problem. Right. So I'm going to move on to responsibilities of the interviewer before the interview. Right. So I'm going to discuss responsibilities of the interviewer before the interview. The interviewer, remember, we said, is that person who is going to interview the applicant, is the person who is going to interview the applicant. The interviewer is the person who is going to interview the applicant. So he has responsibilities. So we're going to discuss the responsibilities of the interviewer before the interview, right? He's supposed to make sure that he dress appropriate, supposed to dress professional, Make sure that is dressed in a professional manner, right? And also he's supposed to make sure that he prepares the venue, supposed to make sure that the venue is clean. He prepares the venue. He also formulates suitable questions to be asked. He also formulates suitable questions that is going to ask the interviewee, right? He has to formulate suitable questions. right? He's supposed to be well groomed. He's supposed to be well groomed. He's supposed to make sure that he prepares the content of the interview. He's supposed to prepare the content of the interview, right? He's supposed to study the CV, the applicants' CVs. He's supposed to study them, right? And also, he's supposed to make sure that he sets effective, open, and closed questions, right? He's supposed to set the effective, open, and closed questions, right? He should also make sure that he is ready ahead of the appointed time, supposed to be available before the applicant arrives in the interview room, right? He's supposed to make sure that there is a suitable venue available for the interview, right? He also has to plan to avoid interruptions such as phone calls and SMS. He's supposed to make sure that he avoids interruptions that might involve someone calling him. He's supposed to set an appointment, right? And also notify the reception that is not available, is busy, right? Is attached so that there will be no interruptions. There will be no interruptions, right? So let's move on to the responsibilities before during the interview. During the interview, right? We are saying the interviewer is supposed to make sure that he gets up, smile, and extend his handshake to welcome the applicant. He's supposed to make sure that he greets the applicant by name, meaning to say he's supposed to know the applicant's name so that he can be able to greet the applicant by name. He's supposed to introduce himself and any other members who are in the interview panel. Supposed to create a supportive, warm atmosphere. How? By asking questions or engaging in small talks, right? They can even engage in small talks so that he can make sure that the applicant is relaxed, to ensure that he creates a favorable, relaxed atmosphere for the applicant during the interview, right? What about the questions when he's answering questions? There are responsibilities that the interviewer has to consider when he is answering and question phase, right? So what he's supposed to do is supposed to ask planned questions that are short, clear, and to the point. Supposed to make sure that he asks questions that are clear and to the point, and the questions are supposed to be short. And he's not supposed to combine two questions in one question. He's supposed to make sure that he does not combine two questions in one question, right? He's not supposed to ask embarrassing questions to the interviewee, right? And I'm talking about awkward questions, right? You're supposed to allow the applicant to talk freely. Supposed to allow the applicant to talk freely. You're supposed not to do more of the talking. Since he's supposed to gather information, he's supposed to gain information. So it means that he's supposed to do more of the listening. Supposed to listen carefully and take notes, right? He's supposed to also to invite the applicants to ask questions, right? He's supposed to ask the applicant to ask questions if he has questions, right? Let's talk about after responsibility of the interviewee, of the interviewer after the interview, right? We call it closure and evaluation phase. So the interviewer should stand up, supposed to thank the interviewee for attending the interview and see him to the door. Supposed to make sure that he stands up, thank the interviewee, and see him to the door, right? So it is also normal for him to shake hands before the applicant leaves the room, right? And also before the next applicant, he's supposed to make sure that he completes the notes before he forgets the details. And also he's supposed to make evaluation objectively. They're supposed to make the evaluation objectively so that he can be able to compare applicants in order to find the best candidate, in order to find the best candidate. So let's move on to the objectives of the applicant, the objectives of the interviewer. Let's move on to the objectives of the interviewer, right? The interviewer has to obtain information about the applicant. He's supposed to make sure that he determines whether the applicant is more suitable for the job. He's supposed to determine whether the applicant is more suitable for the job. He's supposed to inform the applicant about the nature of the job. He's supposed to explain the nature of the job to the applicant. He's supposed to inform the applicant about the nature of the organization, right? The nature of the organization, right? And also, he's supposed to determine whether the applicant will fit well into the culture of the organization. He's supposed to make sure that he determines whether the applicant will fit well into the culture of the organization. It's supposed to make sure that it comes with what with those findings after the interview. Right? Let's move on to objectives of the interviewee. Objectives of the interviewee. So, what does the interviewee? What is she supposed to achieve? Right? He's supposed to persuade the interviewer, right, that is the best candidate, right? So in the other case, he's supposed to market himself, right? Market his qualification, right? So that he'll be chosen as the best candidate. Right. So the interviewee is supposed to gain information about the organization. He's supposed to gain information about the organization. And also, he's supposed to gain more information about the job. He's supposed to gain information about the job and also to test whether the culture of the organization suits his personality. He's supposed to decide whether the culture of the organization suits his personality, right? We're talking about an introvert, right? Whereby maybe a job requires one to talk to clients, to talk to many people, to network. It means that that job might not fit his personality because he's an introvert. He's an introvert. So it is the duty of the employee, so to the duty of the interviewee to check or to test whether the job suits his personality or not, right? Okay, let's move on to the hints for the applicants before the interview. The hints of the applicants before the interview. So before the interview has to do research on the organization, supposed to research on where it is located, supposed to do research on the product or service that the product or service that the organization is providing to the market or selling, right? What does it do? When did the organization started? When it started, right? The company policy, etc., right? It's supposed to make sure that it gathers the personal details like CV, and also certificates, right? It's supposed to organize to ensure that the required personal documents are in place, right? And also, it's supposed to choose an appropriate dress code, right? You're supposed to make sure that, or take into in mind that he's supposed to dress professional. Right? Supposed to make sure that he prepares to answer questions. Right? He's supposed to be punctual, at least 5 minutes, right, before before the interview. Supposed to be at the interview, a venue 5 minutes before the interview. Supposed to be 5 minutes before the interview, right? And also is supposed to establish a rapport on entering the office. Supposed to use the right posture. Supposed to know the right or the correct way of sitting. Supposed to know the correct way of sitting during the interview, right? One not supposed to lean on the chair, right? Supposed to sit upright, right? Supposed to also establish a rapport on the entrance on entering the office. One is not supposed to just open the door and enter. He's supposed to knock and wait for the response, and then he opens and go to where the interviewer are and waiting, and he's supposed to wait to be given a place to sit. He's supposed to wait to be given a place to sit. Right? Those are what we call the rapports that we are talking about. The rapports that we are talking about, right? So let's move on to the hints during the interview. Hints of the applicant during the interview. During the interview. So I think during the interviewee is supposed to keep an eye contact. Is supposed to keep an eye contact, right? By keeping eye contact, it indicates that he's being truthful or he's honest, right? It is an indicator that he's honest, right? He's supposed to listen carefully. The interviewee is supposed to listen to the questions carefully before he answers the questions. He's supposed to listen first and answer the questions, right? So that if he listens first carefully, you'll be able to answer correct questions, right? And then he's supposed to use gestures to support what he's saying, right? He can use non-verbal communication to supplement the verbal communication. He can use gestures to supplement what words, to supplement what he is speaking, right? And also, he's supposed to try to speak clearly and naturally as possible, right? Supposed to speak clearly so that the interviewers will be able to receive effective communication. Is supposed to speak clearly and naturally so that the interviewer will be able to receive effective communication, right? During the answering and posing questions, right? During answering questions, the interviewee is supposed to listen before he speaks, right? Listen before you speak, right? So that you don't end up maybe answering the wrong questions. And also think before you speak. Think, the applicant has to think before he speaks, right? Right. And also, you're supposed to think while you speak and listen to what you are saying. You need to make sure that you think while you speak. You need to listen to what you are saying, right? To see if what you are saying is making sense or not. And also, you're supposed to express your answers clearly and simply, right? And also, answer specific questions specifically. You need to answer specific questions specifically, right? These are the hints on answering and posing questions. One has to listen before speaking. Supposed to listen before you speak. You're supposed to think before you speak. You're supposed to think whilst you are speaking and listen to what you are saying, right? And also you need to express your answers clearly and simply. And lastly, you need to answer specific questions specifically, right? You still remember we talked about specific questions. We say those are questions that require specific answers, right? Let's move on to the listening hints, right? On the applicant side, hints for listening. right? So we're saying, and when you're supposed to look at the interviewer, this will keep you to concentrate. You need to listen at the interviewer. You need to look at the interviewer so that you don't lose concentration. You don't lose out focus, right? And also, you're supposed to avoid being distracted. Avoid anything that might distract you, right? And also, you have to listen attentively. Listen to attentively to details. Listen attentively to details, right? You need to think before you speak. Think before you speak, right? And also make sure that you understand the question properly, right? You need to make sure that you understand what is being asked. You understand what is being asked properly so that you'll be able to answer or you'll be able to give the correct answer. You'll be able to give the correct answer, right? Let's talk about his on living, when living, right? At the end of the interview, you're supposed to thank the interviewer and leave the room with dignity. You need to thank the interviewer, all right? At the end of the interview, you need to thank the interviewer and leave with dignity, right? Make sure that you leave a good impression. Make sure that you leave a good impression. People should be impressed about your presentation, right? When you're leaving, right? So let's talk about creating a positive climate. How can an interviewer creates a positive climate or maybe a warm atmosphere for the applicant, right? So you're supposed to put the applicant at ease so that you'll be able to obtain correct or accurate information, right? So the employee can be helped to relax the applicant can help the employee to relax by one, by making sure the receptionist is expecting the applicants and know his or her name, right? And by greeting the applicant by name, introduce yourself with a firm handshake and show the applicant where to sit. And also, you can use a warm tone of voice for the opening remarks. You can use a warm tone of voice for the opening remarks. That's how an applicant, an interviewer makes sure that an applicant is at easy, right? Right. So you also have to allow the applicant to settle down by engaging in small talks first. Allow the applicant to settle down by engaging in small talks. And also you can use simple, clear language and words which the applicant should know, right? You're supposed to use simple language, avoid jargon, avoid ambiguous questions, right? So that the applicant will be able to understand the questions, right? And also, lastly, be aware of stereotyping, applying personal judgments or prejudice and ethnocentric behavior, ethnocentric behavior. Avoid this ethnocentric, sorry, you need to avoid prejudices, and also you need to avoid ethnocentric behavior, whereby you believe that your culture is more superior than other culture. Your culture is more superior than other culture, right? So let's move on to what you call a disciplinary interview. A disciplinary interview. A disciplinary interview, right? A disciplinary interview. It is known it is under the persuasive interviews, whereby one will be. It is a way of persuading when the management or the supervisor is persuading the employee to change his behavior, right? And also to become effective member of the organization or of the workforce, right? So a disciplinary interview we're going to define it is a pre-planned, confidential, formal, face-to-face conversation between the employer and the employee, right, in order to persuade an employee to change his behavior and become an effective member of the workforce, right? An interview whereby a person is being persuaded to change his behavior, right, so that he becomes effective within an organization, right? So let's talk about situations whereby a person can be called or can be called for a disciplinary interview, right? It might be an assault or a sexual harassment, a report on sexual harassment, or maybe an employee refuses to obey instructions, or maybe he went absent without permission, or maybe he's always drunk at work, right? And also maybe sometimes when the employee is sleeping on duty, and also it might be due to poor performance on the job, and lastly, theft of company or employee property. For example, an employee has stolen company resources. It can be called for a disciplinary interview. Can be called for a disciplinary interview, right? Let's move on to the word assertiveness. Assertiveness, right? Assertiveness is not aggressiveness, right? So, what is assertiveness? It is when one insists on maybe expressing his rights, right? And then and put his side of the story by not being aggressive, right? Whereby one can calmly explain in his or her own views of the circumstances leading to the offense and suggest ways to improve the situation in the future. When one use politely words, kind words, when expressing his opinion, when one uses polite words and kind words when explaining his opinion, right? That's what you call assertiveness. Assertiveness, one is expressing himself, but while he is calm and polite, right? That's what you call assertiveness. Assertiveness, right? Right. So during an interview, one has to make sure that you use correct words. Use correct words. For example, one has to avoid making subjective statements, and also one has to avoid using the words always or never. And then one has to never use swear words. Swear words is not supposed to swear. It's supposed to use decent words, all right? Polite words, all right? Let's talk about non-verbal communication on the interviewee, right? So the following behavior can be perceived as negative non-verbal communication, right? So these include avoiding an eye contact, right? It is considered as what? As negative non-verbal communication, or nervous gestures, or aggressive body language, or it might be moving restlessly about the office, or not being able to sit still. We call it what you call a negative non-verbal communication. It is a negative non-verbal communication. Thank you so much for your time. Please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, right, so that you receive notification every time when we post. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good day.